Okay, I think we are live. Welcome, everyone. My name is Alex Minami. I am the Community Engagement Manager here at Seattle Opera, and it is my sincere pleasure to welcome you all back to Tagney Jones Hall, either in person or tuning in via our YouTube live stream. It's also my sincere pleasure and honor to be welcoming our esteemed panelists here today. I would like to begin by introducing our moderator for today's community conversation, Vivian Phillips. Vivian is a communications professional and arts leader. She is co-host of the podcast Double Xposure, where she and veteran arts journalist Marcy Silman use their voice and platform to plumb the deepest depths and the tiniest cracks of our world to understand how culture and creativity shape our lives. Vivian is also the founder and editor-in-chief of the online magazine Art Noir, a gathering place to explore and center the dynamic creativity, soulfulness, and power of Black art. Vivian has served in numerous communications and art leadership roles, most recently with the Seattle Theater Group and the Seattle Arts Commission. She currently chairs the board of For Culture and serves on the University of Washington Foundation Board. Vivian practices as a communications strategic advisor and arts consultant, actively advocating and creating opportunities for the inclusion of Black and artists of color, Black artists and artists of color in major developments and projects across our city. Thank you, Vivian, so much for moderating tonight's event. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much,
here.
Alex. I appreciate it. Well, before we get started, I just want to say how grateful I am to Seattle Opera for hosting these community conversations, for inviting the community into this beautiful space so that we can have an opportunity to explore not only what's going on stage, but how what's going on stage relates to what's going on in our community. Before we get started, though, we are going to do a land acknowledgement, and I feel so honored this evening that Tracy Rector is with us, and so I am imposing upon Tracy, who is of Indigenous and African American descent, to deliver the land acknowledgement, if you don't mind.
Thank you so much. Again, my name is Tracy Rector, and I'd like to acknowledge that we here this evening are gathering upon Coast Salish territory, the traditional homelands of the Duwamish peoples. I'd like to also reflect that during this time of harvest, this time of year, we're not far away from, as what I understand is the duck gathering territory just by the water. So it's always wonderful to understand how peoples and communities lived upon these lands for tens of thousands of years in reciprocity with the natural world. If you would like to understand where you are living, the lands that you live upon, you can go to nativeland.ca. Also, to go beyond land acknowledgements, I encourage everyone to understand, come to know, and to learn more about the Indigenous communities near you, especially when it comes time to giving. I strongly encourage to donate to Native and Indigenous-run organizations. In these times of the climate crisis, it's so important to understand that Indigenous peoples are in the front lines of protecting our biodiversity and our world. So, thank you.
Thank you so very much, Tracy. And we do acknowledge and encourage everyone who's watching to think about what a land acknowledgement means to you, that it's not just this obligatory statement that we're making, that it should mean something to you. We also want to let online viewers know that you can submit questions in the YouTube stream comment thread. I think I got that right. YouTube stream comment thread. There's so many different ways these days, so I'm behind the times a little bit. Now, I just want to say as well that I have never seen La Bohème. I've never seen the opera, but I've seen Rent. and I've also seen Moulin Rouge. And those are two beautiful pieces that were inspired by La Bohème. I love in Rent where they sing La Vie Bohème, and it just reminds me of this beautiful, beautiful opera, and got a chance, I listened to it, but I've never seen it. I got a chance to like watch Luciano Pavarotti sing it, and you're like, whoa, my God, this is really something. But the story is largely focused on love between a poor poet and a poor seamstress. And we would identify those people today as gig workers or members of the creative community, for sure. But at the base of this particular story, what I think is there is a story about relationships, about community, and about the love of community that these artists have, and also their interdependency upon one another. So when we get into the conversation, we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about that. But these artists create community in such a beautiful way, and it's not unlike what you all do in your everyday work. But before we get into the conversation and get to introduce all of you, I think we are going to have a special performance treat. We are going to hear from Brandy Sutton, accompanied by David McDade. Brandy will be performing the role of Musetta in La Bohème, and David is a longtime staff member who serves as the head of Coach Accompanist. So if we might, I would love to welcome both Brandy and David. And I will add that it's Musetta's Waltz. It takes place in the second act, right, in Cafe Momas. Yay, all right. Beautiful, beautiful. We'll be back. We will definitely be coming back to see you perform. Thank you. And thank you very much, David. So Sharon, you said that you would...
No, I'm good. I'm gonna sit right here and stay in my lane.
I think you said earlier that you had been, practicing. So I just wanted to know, did you still want to, back up for? Okay.
I'm not ready.
Good. Well, this past 18 months, in fact, it feels to me like it's been 25 years. I don't know how long it's been actually. But the past 18 months has been quite interesting for everyone. And I think one of the things that I have actually most enjoyed is that I've had an opportunity to really have real conversations with artists in our community. We've had a chance to connect on a whole different level. We're not just doing business, we're connecting and creating community. So I want to start by asking each of you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your field of work and interject what it's been like for you all in the last 18 months as creatives in this city. Let's start with you, Sharon.
Hello, I am Sharon Nyree Williams. I am the Executive Director for the Central District Forum for Arts and Ideas. We produce Black cultural work, and we also help develop artists so that they can produce their own work as well. I'm also a storyteller. I love telling stories about my life, the things I observed, and around social issues. And I do a few other things, but for the last 18 months, how it's been for me, it's been one of, when you're in a leadership role, one of a roller coaster ride, of one of really paying attention to your staff and their needs, and not just your needs, and just trying to make sure that they are taken care of, as well as the artists that you work with. And then as an artist, it was one of, I'm not ready to tell this story about being in COVID right now. And so it was making the decision to say no to opportunities, but then also trying to figure out how to present my work online.
Interesting. Thank you so much. You are a lot of other things. Maybe we'll get to it during the course of the conversation. The same is true for Tracy Rector. Tracy, tell us what you're doing, what's your field of work right now, and how this last 18 months has affected your field of work.
Sure, thank you. So there's been a lot of time to reflect, and one of the things that I came to understand this year was that exactly 35 years ago, I first began volunteering for Daybreak Star Cultural Center, as well as Atlantic Street Youth Program. So I've been embracing the journey that I've been on for 35 years, working towards Indigenous and Black liberation, and feeling just the power of committing my life to be in service to our peoples. And that's just changed my outlook and my framing for how I've been, choosing to use my time. I've been working harder than ever. And this is coming from a person who has been a filmmaker for 20 years, a community organizer, an arts curator, running a scrappy nonprofit. And now I find myself working with an organization that's in solidarity with Indigenous peoples to protect this earth. And in order to do that, it's a 24/7 commitment. And so I'm really looking towards my ancestors more and more these days to find the strength, to carry forward that mission. Also, just to note that my father passed away last May, and we couldn't gather in the way we normally would because of the pandemic. And I found a photo of my great-grandmother, Samuela, that I had never seen before. And I've been wearing my hair like this, the way that she wore her hair. I see her as a warrior. She was Black, she was Indigenous, and she just had that look, that look of being in the fields, working hard, just living. And so I've been feeling that strength and really wanting to make time on a daily basis to honor her survivitude and thrive more and more. And it's not easy.
What's the organization that I know you founded Longhouse Media, correct?
Yep.
And I know that you're a filmmaker. I know that you're a curator. You're working with a different nonprofit right now, correct?
Yes. So I am the co-founder of Longhouse Media and founder of Indigenous Showcase. But today I'm working for an organization called Niatero, and that's it's been pretty awesome. It's a global organization, so I'm on a really steep learning curve, working with peoples in Africa, the Pacific, and South America, and all thinking through how do we fight for the next 7 generations to have a healthy planet.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Yep.
Now, Miss Amanda, I know that your whole life is dependent upon you being able to perform, right? Yes. You don't have like this other thing that you can do. So tell us what you do and how you've adapted over this last 18 months.
Yeah, so is this on?
Yeah.
It is? Okay.
Yeah.
My name is Amanda Morgan. I'm a professional ballet dancer at Pacific Northwest Ballet. It's about to be my 6th year there. So when the pandemic hit, it basically just made us all shut down. A lot of my colleagues, including myself, were obviously upset because we couldn't perform, but in a way, there was a lot of things that opened up opportunities for me in a way that I didn't think it would, because the workplace that I'm in is so structured, and I'm really young. So in a ballet company, when you're young, you have your certain opportunities, and then you're kind of like meant to learn stuff, or you're just in the back, or you're doing your thing. And so it can be kind of hard to like constantly be able to find yourself in that. And then at the time, I was the only Black woman in the company, the first one in like 30 years. So it has been hard, to say the least. But I think once the pandemic, right before the pandemic hit, I was actually thinking of quitting dance. I was like to a point where I was like, even though I was only 23 at the time, I was like, I can't keep doing this. It's just, I feel like I'm like banging my hands against a wall, and like nothing is changing. I'm trying to do everything I can, nothing is changing. And then the pandemic happened and everything stopped, and people actually had time to think. And so what I did was like, I could sit and mope around and be like, oh, am I gonna quit, or am I gonna just, what do I do now? And so I like to choreograph a lot. I've been choreographing. I have my own organization, slowly turned into an organization called the Seattle Project, which I'm trying to just open myself up to working with different artists in Seattle, and also just creating spaces, especially for BIPOC and LGBTQ artists, to share their stories and create work, and I'm hoping I can build that. But because of this pandemic, I was really able to focus in on that, and I ended up getting to choreograph for Seattle Dance Collective. I ended up getting to choreograph for Pacific Northwest Ballet, like one of the youngest people. Like as a Black woman, it was really awesome. So there has been a lot of wonderful things that has come from it. And one of the things I'm like most happy about is that once the pandemic happened, I was able to actually start a mentorship program for the students in the school. And it was me and another colleague of mine, Cecilia Iliasu. We talked with 5 levels of students once a week, starting from like March 2020, like up until now. We're still doing it, but it's we've added more people, more dancers to it, and now these students have a support system, and something that like I didn't have, when I was in the school there. And so I can, even though I'm young, and I thought that maybe, like a lot of young people maybe feel like, oh, we've lost, our formative years, our young years, we can't go out or do, go to concerts, all these things. It's like, you can change things, you don't have to be this age or that age. And then on top of all of that, there are protests and things were happening in Seattle,
right.
And so I was very much on the ground protesting and putting myself in harm's way, but at the same time, I was like, I need to do this because it's something I truly believe in, and I'm going to talk to my, director about it. I'm going to talk to my executive director about it. I'm going to tell them, like, we're not just dancers, we're not just artists, like, we're humans, Like, yeah.
And it is one of the things I want to ask you all about too, because we focus a lot on the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, but it feels to me that, and we'll talk about equity and how things are shifting, so to speak, towards a more equitable environment, but it feels to me as in every critical time in America or around the world, artists are leading. So with the social justice issues that came up, I'm just curious, and I know that you got very involved. You were in the protest and you started to speak up. In fact, I saw that you were featured on a National Endowment for the Arts podcast around your work that you kind of did in the community. But Tracy and Sharon, how did that social justice movement give you more fortification as an artist, or did it strip you down a little bit? And maybe it did both.
Yeah, my oldest child is a live streamer as part of that, and so from day one was on the ground, and so I just stood up as a mama and just showed up. And it was pretty amazing to see their fierceness just being on the front line, in part leading the movement in coalition with a bunch of other powerful voices, which just gave me strength and hope. And to be on the ground, to see that organizing, to see the ways that people are breaking down the boxes and breaking down the norms and figuring out new ways of envisioning what community can be and thinking through opportunities to uplift mutual aid was so incredibly important. And the critical voices as part of that conversation were usually artists.
Yeah.
And just enlivening that mission and that energy. But the thing that was, again, I work for an organization that's global, that those movements here, the Black Lives Matter movement has empowered people throughout the entire globe. And so just in terms of being a storyteller and advocating and uplifting storytellers around the world and seeing those connections of when you act locally, the impact globally is incredible.
Cool, thanks. Yeah.
And for me, it was trying to figure out what do I do as an arts leader and as an artist. Like, I'm not one to go and do marches and things of that nature, totally to support them, but I'm just not one to do them. And I believe everyone has their way of supporting a movement, and they may do something else. And so what we did at Central District Forum for Arts and Ideas, we started putting the artists' voices out there specifically. Not just talking about artists, but we started doing interviews with artists so they can say how they felt, what they were going through, and then being able to pay them for their time because they weren't performing. And that was really huge for us because some people would say that, we're going to give this money to artists, we're going to give that money to artists, and this is how artists are feeling. And we really wanted to put the spotlight on exactly how they were doing and hear it from them themselves. And then it was, what do I do? How do I get involved behind the scenes? What can I do? And so I spent a lot of time talking to my mentor, and I remember having a conversation with Stephanie Ellis-Smith, the founder of the Central District Forum for Arts and Ideas, and I called her and I said, I'm being torn. Do I do community or do I be an arts leader? How do I decide? What did you do? And she was very honest, and she said, I never had to face this, Sharon. Right. This is new. And so she said to me, how about this? How about dedicating this time right now and being very specific about how you work in community, and then you can then move when that has settled down. You can then focus on the organization. And so I talked to my staff and I said, this is what I'm gonna do. And that's what made me join the Equitable Initiatives Community Task Force for the mayor to put $30 million in the community. And that meant I could be at the table as an artist and push it out there and give that time. And my staff supported me in doing that.
Thank you for that, too. Thank you for that work. And I often ask myself, I wonder to what extent would these things be happening had it not been for such a world-changing event. both the pandemic and the social justice movement. And I believe that all things happen exactly when and how they're supposed to anyway. But one of the themes in La Bohème is, it's bohemian, right? This whole concept of being a bohemian has been essentially assigned to the arts community. But what has also been assigned to the arts community is this vow of poverty. And the one thing that I think about just driving here today, essentially, is, even in La Bohème, they were housed. They had a place to be. It wasn't the greatest place in the world. Same thing true with rent, right? You got to pay the rent. But how do you all, or how were you moved around the necessities of creating community among artists and taking care of one another? Was that intensified as a result of what we were experiencing?
I mean, I know in my case, it was intensified with artists that I knew outside of PNB. It was intensified more so with my artists of color that I know, because I know that is like just a very different experience to go through. And then, I mean, I think it intensified other people that are friends with me that were like, are you okay? Like things like that. But I think in general, I was just kind of aware of like, just thinking in general about like humanity and like trying to be kinder to people, trying to like have these moments because we had masks on. There was no like, so it's just like even trying to have conversations, even if it's 6 feet away, like I was more aware of that than I was before the pandemic happened and before all of that happened. And now I feel like I'm able to actually really like indulge and be grateful in those moments because they are really, really special and honestly matter more so than a lot of other things.
I've heard the word gratitude and gratefulness used more in the last 2 years than I ever have in my whole life. And I do think that that's what we've experienced. Tracy, Sharon, you want to pop in?
Yeah, for me, it was picking up the phone. I think I spent more time on FaceTime and Zoom and with family and friends and other artists of just calling to say, how are you doing? Is there anything I can do for you? Can we have this conversation? Like, I don't want anything. I'll leave a message and say, I don't want anything. I think I learned that from our friend Umeme from a long time ago of just, sometimes it's just about, with other leaders, I'll send a text and say, I'm thinking of you, love you, and just really trying to keep that connection and that bond and let people know that I was thinking about them no matter what was happening. And I think it just made me relish in relationship. And when you're going through things and when you go through your career, people are telling you that it's all about relationship. And I got an opportunity to really see what it meant to be in relationship with folks and really appreciate them for who they are, not for what they do. And I think that's one of the major things that I took away from this time period.
Tracy, did you have those experiences as well?
Yeah, I guess as part of this conversation, what came to mind for me was, walking here tonight. I was like, oh, Lord, I don't even know if I know how to talk in public anymore. How do I be in relationship to people? And I've been thinking about that. As an artist, I'm a really sensitive person. And I was on the go, like pre-pandemic. I was plugged in all the time, not feeling my feelings, just being and showing up. And I've had time to sit with my feelings, and that hasn't always been great. It's been kind of isolating and lonely and painful in many ways, but it's also allowed me to, morph into this kind of new Tracy that's thoughtful, that pauses, that thinks ahead rather than just kind of showing up and being, but just really takes into consideration other people in a new way. And so I am grateful for that, but it's not easy because I recognize in this moment I feel awkward, and it reminds me of being a kid. just like feeling awkward all the time. So I don't know. So I'm relearning. So in many ways, it's a coming out of Tracy in a different form as an artist.
That's good. You know, I'm gonna miss food deliveries. It's the one thing that I really grew to love, right, during the pandemic, is I got lots of food deliveries. You know, Sharon, you talked about kind of that shift as a leader that you had to make. It was a difference between really empowering a staff versus taking care of your staff. I'm curious about whether or not all of you experienced a surge or a necessity to step up as a leader. And what was that moment like, if you can identify a moment that you actually had to become this leader? You know, Musetta in La Bohème, she's the one that takes action to get her friend's rent paid, right? It's not the cutest thing in the world, but she does that. And it just made me think about, you know, in these environments, somebody has to step up and say, okay, we got to go this direction.
I think for me, I've had to learn how to become a leader virtually, which is just so weird. And it's virtually, but then there's also this other layer of recognizing having to become a counselor too, that, you know, in this moment with staff, you know, and recognizing that a number of artist friends have lost housing or have had to, you know, move into different housing situations or major life changes. That's been a way that I've been learning to show up as a leader, is just being a deep listener and learning to be compassionate, empathetic, but also that takes a lot, you know, and learning how in this moment, virtually practicing these new skills, stepping up in a new way, do I take care of myself too? And so that's been a big learning curve to think through my own health and well-being, you know, in this moment.
I recognize it as intentional compassion, which is, you know, a muscle that you have to actually exercise and learn how to build. I want to move on to talk about economic and equitable recovery, because that's where a lot of the conversations in the arts community are now being centered. When we are returning to a performance environment, you know, of any kind, as well as just thinking about how the arts are supported in our community, equity is at the forefront of that. What are your hopes, I guess I should say, for how Seattle, our community, addresses equitable recovery?
I think what I learned from being on the task force with the city was that you have to have different cultures at the table together in order to make these type of decisions. And that way you can get a better understanding, not just what, for me, the Black community is going through, or what I feel as though the Black community is going through, but what other cultures have been going through too, and working together. And to know that I'm not the only spokesperson for the Black community. My Black community is centered to me, but they might be in a whole different aspect of what or who they're engaging with. So on the task force, we had leaders in the Muslim community. We had leaders in the Native American community. We had leaders in the Asian community. And it was like, okay, we're in this. And it felt like America, right? It felt like I have a better understanding of America. And in being in those conversations, I learned so much about being able to ask the question. I learned in that group that I could be a leader amongst leaders, but do it in a way that centers community. And so I think the thing about what I hope is that what we had in that room, I hope that transpires for other rooms, to where it's not just the one Black dancer or the one Native American Black filmmaker in the room, that we're all in the room together and we're making art that we're happy about, and that the organizations look like the community. And it's not lopsided, because we all bring something to the table. So when we talk about equity and we talk about getting the funding and all that stuff into the community, that we start to looking at the balance beam of it all, and that the gig artist is making as much money as the artist that is working for a huge organization, that the gig artist has a house just like the person that's working for an organization or a person that's running an organization, that we realize that we all want, some of us want the same things and some of us want different things, but that we're at the table to communicate that.
You know, the Equitable Development Initiative was a response. It was reactive, essentially. Tracy, I want to ask you specifically, given what Sharon has just shared, what are your hopes for how policy might shift based on this one reactive action? How do you want to see that embedded in policy?
I don't know if I'm allowed to say this because I don't know if he's a funder, but why didn't we tax Bezos? Like, how many billions of dollars? I'm sorry, but billionaires of...
So you're about to tax the rich.
I'm all about tax the rich. You know, when I think about equity and I think about how much do we all pay for parking tonight, that made it accessible for us to be here. I want that every day. I don't want capitalism to be governing our ability to be together in community, to have access to arts. I want mutual aid to be part of life. I want education for all. I want low and reduced access to healthy, safe living conditions. I want low parking rates. I want all of that, and I want to tax the rich. I'm all about that, so.
All right, there's a policy agenda. That's new. We never heard that one before, right? Amanda, thinking about you as a up-and-coming leader, and you may not see yourself as that right now. It's a label that you're getting tonight because you actually are. But what are some of your visions for how policy changes and shifts should be made in order for us to have an equitable arts environment?
So this is a very particular place, but at PMB, for instance, are like a huge nonprofit organization that has tons of funders. You talk about equity, and you can add a few people of color into the mix, but usually they're dancers, or maybe one's a choreographer, and it's like one choreographer out of like 20 for the year. But when you look at the people that are in the front of the room, the people that are the ones making decisions, if that isn't reflective of what we see every day in the community, then like it's not going to change. So for me, that's like one thing that I want to really push for. Like in general with any arts thing, is like I want to see people that look like me, or look like how our community looks like, which is diverse. It's not just this or that, and it's not just tokenized. There's not just one of this and one of that, but there's multiple. I want to see multiple artists of color. So yeah.
So you're looking for shifts in organizations that then possibly have an opportunity to help move policy forward in a different way.
Yeah.
Sharon, I was talking with a mutual friend, Michael Greer, earlier today, actually, and we were talking about how incremental changes can lead to big shifts. I'm curious about what you all think about the way in which you are watching change towards equity in the arts environment take place. Are you looking for big sweeping changes immediately, or are there, small things that you're kind of making note of that organizations are doing? or even that you're doing in your own organizations to push forward an equity agenda?
Well, I think about in my role as the managing director of storytelling at Neotero, one thing that I get to do is I have a grant portfolio. And so I'm in the position of, having been an artist for 20 years, you know what it's like, writing those, applications, writing those grant submissions. It's laborious. And so one of the decisions that's incremental is applying that lived experience to the way that we do grant making, which is how can we reduce the barriers to access? How can we make it easy? How can we get resources out the door? And recognizing there's no need for half of those hoops that are often in place. And so I think about incremental change is like, how can we as leaders make decisions in our life? Because that has reverberating impacts as well.
I think as long as people aren't hiding behind incremental change, if the excuse isn't, we have to make these small changes before something big can happen. And I'm like, okay, so what's so hard about putting out a job description and making sure that it's not going to the same people that it's always been? What's so hard about sending that job description to HBCUs? What's so hard about sending that job description to the Black community or the Native community? Why can't you do that? Is that really hard? And to change your scope. And don't think that you have to give us a job just to fill a position, but we are qualified. We are highly qualified. So don't hide behind affirmative action or anything like that to make it happen, or we have to do this. There are qualified people out there as long as you get the information to them. And so I'm okay if you're saying, we can't change it this grant cycle, but we'll change it the next grant cycle because we're already in. Okay, but I'm gonna be waiting for next year, and it better be a big change because you have now a year to make the change. I'm not okay with people saying that, well, we can't change our entire season to look more colorful, but they just did that on Broadway, right? So we can't do it locally? You know what I'm saying? Like, what you hiding for? You trying to tell me there ain't no Black playwrights out there? Come on now. Like, there's access to stuff out there. And so, yes, some things have to be incremental, right? With the city, you got to go through all these budgets and changes, and all these people got to okay it. But there's things in your organization that doesn't have to be incremental, and don't hide behind that.
Well, maybe the question that I'll pose to you, Amanda, is what does that look like in community in order for those kinds of, changes to be made? Sharon is one voice. She's made that very clear, right? So how in the arts community do you think that we can coalesce and move these kinds of issues forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think accountability is definitely one, and accountability and camaraderie, with artists in general, even if it's not your organization, but you're passionate and you're like, hey, I have an artist friend that is saying, this needs to happen, the more voices and the more pressure we put on people to change things, it's more likely to change. I know that might sound I don't know. I like to think more hopefully, but then I I get caught in the thing where I'm like, oh, it's gonna everything's gonna happen at once, and then it doesn't at all. But I think it's just this, with myself at least, I feel like it's just I need to be consistent and constant, and it's just a constant pressure, a constant okay, well, what are you doing next? Okay, you did this, great, but what are we doing next? What are we doing more of now? What are we gonna change now? Not just oh, we did this and now we're good. No, it needs to just keep going and going because this is constant work that needs to happen. And I think artists can definitely band together to do that.
Go ahead.
But it makes me think this question around equity, Vivian, you was heading the Seattle Arts Commission, and we had this, and Tracy, we were on the Arts Commission together at the same time. And Amanda, you will be on the Arts Commission soon. And we were pushing equity. Equity was, and this was years ago, right? And we was pushing equity. And so Seattle, I know in Seattle, it was already being put out there as something to do. And then everything, the social unrest happened. And I was like, okay, now let's really do it. And so some things I'm like, these aren't new conversations for us. We've been having these conversations for years around equity and housing and paying artists at their right rates and getting different people that look like us in the spaces. And now, don't give me an excuse of why that can't happen immediately,
Right.
because you've had the time.
Right, right. You know, I feel the same way. Thank you very much, Sharon, for bringing that up, because I'm like, what time is it? Wasn't that 10 years ago when we were talking about this? But I think that it is indicative in many ways of the way in which our community segregates the arts. I think that there is this thing that happens where it's everything else and then the arts. And so now they've learned how to learn from us, I think, because we've been in the forefront. But that's also another thing about the arts community and artists. They lead, even if you're not, considering yourself to be a leader. So as we lead into the more optimistic, changed times of the future, how do you all think that large, mid-size, and small arts organizations can work together for the good of the whole arts community?
I'd really love to see organizations come together and to leverage their collective power for space and to start taking up space, having land, having community centers. And I hear these conversations happening. For example, I know Northwest Film Forum is starting to do kind of an assessment of what does it look like to be in community with other arts nonprofits to create a holistic space to take care of community. That's really exciting, and I love hearing those conversations.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I think,
Thoughts?
at least at Pacific Northwest Ballet, I've told them, we can't just expect people to come into our space and watch our shows. Like, we need to create space for other artists and so that they can show their work too. And that's going to take a little bit longer than I'd hope it would, but instead of just bringing shows to the International District or the Central District, it's like, who's to say that there's art already there? Each culture has art, it has dance, it has music, and so when you're already kind of presenting yourself as an elitist art form, because I am in ballet, which is quote unquote an elitist art form, it already ostracizes the rest away. So I think we need to get the arts community together in general, first, before we do any of that. And it feels really separate, at least for me, because there's so many people that I'm still meeting, because it's just so separate, at least at PMB.
Yeah.
And I think it is changing little by little, but I'm trying to venture out, and I think other people are too. And if we keep doing that, I think that it will just have more space for more narratives, more stories, more things to be told, and hopefully it'll look a lot like what we see out on the street.
I was thinking, what would happen if this conversation was one that wasn't just for the public, but it was, we can just come together and talk across organizations too. Go ahead, Tracy. Tracy, I'm sorry, and then Sharon.
Oh, yeah, sure. I was going to jump in, too. I'm starting to see a trend where people are rejecting art as commodity, too, and I think that's where we're going to start seeing that art's not just this separate thing, but artists are coming together in collectives just for the sake of creating art again, just self-expression, community care, and I love that. I love the rejection of it's not about the performance of creating for others, but it's just about being in community and creating together. That's
And I think
inspiring.
Yeah.
I think
nice.
that is inspiring of just thinking of it as we are community, and getting rid of the eliteness of it all, and getting out there and rolling up your sleeves and doing the work. When it comes to small, medium, and large organizations, being at a small, medium organization myself, I don't know where we fall. It's one of those things where when we work with larger organizations, we're working with the people that's doing the work, right? We're not meeting with the executive directors or things of that nature. It's just the people that are the community department that's coming to meet with us and say, yeah, we're about this and we're about that. And you're like, oh, really? Okay, where's your executive director at? Because on my level and for my organization, I'm at the table in a lot of those conversations when it comes to partnership and things that I'm not sending anybody else to have that conversation.
Yeah.
I'm making that decision. So I think it's about respect. Respect the organization. If you're really about bringing more Black and brown folks into your community, if you're really about partnering with us, then come have a conversation. Come and get to know me. Let me look in your eyes, because that's how we do it, right? As a Black person, I'm gonna tell you, we look in your eyes, we look at your facial expression, we look at everything, and we be like, yeah, he was playing me. He wasn't telling me the truth at all. I don't believe a word that came out of his mouth. And so that's the playing field we need to be on. And the other day we got to be in, Vivian and I had an opportunity to be in a conversation where it was both large organizations and a couple of small organizations, and we got to have that real conversation, and it was just like, we need more of this, where we can be real and not be censored.
Thank you. I pulled something off of, the internets, and that must be right, correct? But it was this little piece of information about how the whole Bohemian Society kind of became a Bohemian Society. And I actually remember gypsies who used to live in Seattle. I didn't know that they were creatives, right? And I know that that's no longer an appropriate term. I get it, but I'm, letting you know how I came across it. But this little piece of information about how in 1530, the English tried to expel the Romani, who are the Bohemians, essentially, from Britain. They thought they were from Egypt. With the Egyptians Act, a surviving document that is indicative of the misconception being widespread at the time. What is interesting to me about this is that the English tried to make that expulsion, and that it was without the recognition that racism underpinned all of this segregation, even in Europe, and this work against a neo-European way of considering art. You work in a high art, totally European art form, right? Yes. Do you ever feel like you don't belong there?
I ask myself this every day, honestly, I do. I'm obviously one of the only people of color there, but I'm also really tall and really lanky, and a lot of times the stories or the things that we're doing doesn't feel indicative of who I am or, anything that my family, my ancestors have gone through. I'm like, when am I gonna see something about, I don't know, like the Tainos, like it's like different things that I feel like I can connect with. And like there are certain themes, like, a general love story, a general this or that, everyone can kind of, relate to, but a lot of times it's, like, there's so many heteronormative narratives that are still told, and I'm tired of it. I'm like, okay, how many times are you gonna find out the boy and the girl get together? Okay, great, like, but what else, So it's definitely hard, and I think that's part of the reason why I wanted to be a choreographer, because there are a lot of times in my company where I do not get used just because of the way that either I look, I stand out in a way that they're like, she takes the attention away. She's not right for it. And I'm like, well, what classifies as right for the part? I'm doing the technique right, I'm doing everything right, so it's clearly something else. And it's happened to me since I joined the company. It's still happening to me today, here and there. You know, I wasn't in the last rep, you know? So it's just like finding ways to either create space within that, or sometimes you just have to make your own, like, stuff, your own pieces yourself. So I was like, I'm not gonna wait for someone to make a piece of me, I'm gonna go make stuff myself. I'm not gonna wait.
And I asked the same question to both Sharon and Tracy. Do you ever feel completely and totally out of place? You know, not just because you might be the only one in the room, but because you are the creative and your brain essentially works a little bit differently than traditional leaders, or maybe leaders who are more inclined towards a Eurocentric way of leading. I'm glad I made you laugh.
Yes. I was once on the board for Cornish College of the Arts. And it was interesting because I was in the elevator going up on my first day as a board of trustee. And I'm talking to the guy in the elevator with me, and he proceeds to tell me that he's been on the board for 40 years. And I'm like, I'm 43. Okay. And he's a non-black person. And I'm just like, what the heck is gonna happen when I walk into this room? And so I walk into the room and I'm so uncomfortable. And I see Dorothy Mann, who is a wonderful, wonderful leader here in Seattle. And I'm like, whew, we got Dorothy. That's good. And then we got me. Okay. And then, okay. And then I had an opportunity to watch Dorothy engage. And I realized that we oftentimes don't get that ability to watch somebody like us engage and don't be afraid. And I came in the room afraid. Like, what am I doing on this board? Okay, why did I join it? What am I doing here? None of these people look like me. I don't know what to do. And then just hearing Dorothy talk made me more comfortable. And then I was like, Sharon, you're here because you used to work at a university. Sharon, you're here because you're a working artist. Sharon, you're here because you run an organization. And I'm as the meeting going on, I'm starting to ask questions. I'm like, excuse me, can you tell me about you and the faculty, right? And I'm like asking questions. I'm like, ooh. And then by the time I left that meeting, I was like, yeah, I belong here. None of y'all look like me. Y'all don't do what I do. Some of y'all aren't artists. And so I've entered into spaces that are uncomfortable, and then I've changed it to make myself comfortable. And it's because of powerful black women in my life that have shown me the way, and I've been able to watch. And that's why people like us have to be in the room.
I love that. So it's not anyone's responsibility to make you feel comfortable in the way you move. It's all about your own perception. Love that. Thank you. Tracy, thoughts?
So many thoughts. Well, I'll start off with I always feel imposter syndrome all the time, no matter what I do, no matter, just that's a constant. In my industry, if I can call it an industry, media making, when I first started 20 years ago, 15% of all media makers were BIPOC. And then 20 years later, can you take a guess what that is? Still 15%. After all, I think it has gone down a little bit too. After all the initiatives, after all the money, after all the, co-thinking and leaders, it's systemic, right? And there's that idea about Audre Lorde's quote about, you know, you can't use the master's tools, take down the master's house, and I'm constantly like, I can't keep fighting, you know, and like knocking on these doors. And so always, always, always embracing, how do we do this differently? How do we build our own tables? How do we show up in a different way that's unexpected, that kind of disrupts that tension, that energy of always me personalizing and inevitably feeling like I'm an imposter. And I have a really great example of this. I was invited to Sundance for their summit as a mentor and to be a guest speaker and teach and train and that whole bit for a week. And after I got done speaking at this one event, this guy came up to me. He's like, "You don't look like a successful producer. How did you get here?" This is a young man of color. And I was just like, who are you talking to? Like, why are you so brainwashed? Whose Kool-Aid did you drink? You know, obviously I'm here because I've done something. I have something to offer. And it was interesting in that moment, it like drew up in me that kind of fight back, like, no, you can't accept the norm. You're just feeding into this, like, this BS. Anyway, yes, I am embracing the bohemian.
I love it. Very good.
Yes.
In La Bohème, one of the things that the artist community is absolutely concrete about is that they want to be able to be artists for the sake of being artists. I'm curious about any barriers that you want to share that you all may have faced in order to just be artists. My experience is, you know, when you say, hey, I'm going to be a this, a that, anything that's not a traditional, that's in the arts community, you know, my family would say things like, that's really cool. So what are you going to do to make a living? So what's your real job going to be, you know? Talk about your experiences to fight through to be an artist.
It's a little bit like what I was saying earlier. I'm starting to notice that trend to just do art, be art, create art together for the sake of doing that. So there's not this overarching goal of it's consumptive or something for others. I'm really finding some fire in that, and I think that's going to transform our lives. So I'm really excited by the bravery of those artists just to be exactly who they are unapologetically.
And it's our job to make sure that they can survive. Yes. Yeah. Amanda?
I'm trying to think. I mean, from the get-go, when I said, I want to do ballet, my family was like, huh? They're like, there's no one there that looks like you.
Did they want you to play basketball?
No,
I'm curious. No,
they didn't.
No?
I'm actually, I do school. I go to SU at the same time, and I'm not too, I'm pretty smart. So I was like, they were like, oh, she's going to get a scholarship to college. We're not going to have to worry about it, all of the stuff. And I was like, no, I want to do ballet. Like, I want to dance. Like, you know, and at first my parents were kind of like, okay, but like, it might be harder for you. So don't, you know, get disappointed when you don't get it.
The code word harder.
Yeah.
Yeah, got it. Got
It
it.
might be harder. And then I didn't realize until I went to the School of American Ballet in New York City, and I was like there was two black women in a class of 40 girls. I was 13, and I was like, okay. So this is what they meant. But besides that, I think just like what Tracy was saying, just like do art, be art. I'm trying to just do that in whatever ways I can, whether it's like I'm just making something small or I'm like reaching out to someone saying like, hey, like, do you want to just collaborate on something and make something just to make it? Like, obviously I would love to, you know, it's important to also pay our artists. That is always important if we're doing like an actual project. But sometimes like with my friends, like when we're not doing anything at the ballet and we're like, okay, we're learning this, but we're not probably going to do it. I'm like, okay, let's go into another studio and make something else that we might actually like better. Like, you know, it's like little things like that.
That's cool.
Yeah, just do it. I had the same experience. I went to school and then I got I messed up and got, no, I didn't mess up. I got a master's of business administration. Then I moved to Seattle. And then for a couple years, I worked for a biotech company, little company that made Embryo, the arthritis medicine that you see on TV. And then the company, I couldn't get a job in the arts. I could not. I went on interviews, I ain't know nobody, I couldn't get one, and so I fell back on the master's degree. But then the company merged with another company and I was laid off. And then I had a severance package and I could do whatever I want now. And the art took hold, right? It was like, I'm gonna be an artist, I'm gonna do this. And my grandmother said, I don't know why you broke. You broke out here trying to do this work. What are you doing? You got an MBA. What are you doing? You ain't doing anything. You need to sit. You need to do something, Sharon. You need to stop doing what you're doing. What is that? No, go get a real job. And I was like, yo, I'm happy. I'm so happy right now. But my family didn't understand happiness. They understood I'm doing this because I have to take care of my family. And I'm doing this because that's what they wanted me to do. They understood all of that, but they didn't understand this is what makes me happy. This gives me joy to sit on stage and tell my story. It gives me joy to work with other artists and see them push their art out there. And so being broke was hard. But now I'm in a position to say, you don't have to be a broke artist. Yeah. Because if my generation don't help the next generation figure out what it means to have a business plan, what it means to look at your revenue stream, if we don't help them do that, then I failed. And so now I figured this out during COVID, that my business model has been to do my art and have a steady job along with that. That worked for me. That doesn't necessarily work for Amanda or work for Tracy. And they don't have to be, it doesn't mean that I'm less validated. And it doesn't mean that the artist that's a full-time artist is less validated. But that means that we have to pay them what they're worth so that they can live. And that means for everybody, the nonprofits and the for-profits. And we have to encourage that. Because what we learned during COVID is that art moves us. It helps us keep going when we feel like we can't go anymore. Yeah. And they take that, and I think a lot of people take that for granted. And sitting down there or being in that studio or sitting at that editing bay for hours and hours is perfection. Mm-hmm. It's a doctorate degree at a higher level. And so, yes, I got that. But the way I broke the mold for my family and understanding what I did was I presented, my auntie had passed away, and I had written a piece called Strong Black Woman, and it was a conversation between me and her on her deathbed. And I wrote it right before she died. And my cousin read it to her, and then I read it at the funeral. Mm-hmm. And then that's when everybody started saying, that's what you do? And so now they hold me accountable. Yeah. And they say, oh, you worked that job, okay, but what are you doing about your art? My dad calls me and say, nice. When the last time you wrote something? Mm. And so I had to actually perform for the family for them to get to what I did, to understand what I do and how I do it.
That is so good. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I do think that there's this cultural thing where, in some cultures you're encouraged to go into the arts and to, be this creative. In other cultures, you're encouraged to perform for the family, right? That's just the way it is. Well, before we go into questions, hopefully there are questions in our feed from our viewers. I want to ask each of you to talk about how the pandemic changed you as an artist and how you are coming out on the other side. in that, fully trust in that change?
It's a hard question.
I think we've talked about some of the ways, but just self-identify what changed you as a part of the pandemic.
Yeah, for me, this is a question I've been asking myself a lot because I came back into work at PNB last month, after 18 months. So just like asking myself, oh, like, what were you like before this? And sometimes you get fed up because you're like, oh, like I could do this, and I had this passion, or I could do this. But in other ways, I've kind of I don't know, there's things where I'm just like, I'm saying no more. I'm like, no, I'm not gonna give my energy to that. I'm not gonna even bother getting worked up about that. That has nothing to do with me. In dance or any art field, sometimes it can be competitive. Ballet is very competitive. And so sometimes you can like think you're the worst dancer if you don't get something. It's like, it has nothing to do with you sometimes. So like in ways I've gained a lot of perspective in like what is important and what isn't. And I think, most of all, I want to keep growing. And that's not just like growing within like working in the studio, but growing as a person and like having these experiences and venturing out and actually like meeting all of these different types of artists, because that's like where that growth really comes in and you learn so much. If you're surrounded by the same people all the time, like there's only so much that you can learn and so far that you can grow. And at this point, I feel like sometimes I'm the one having to like push myself rather than like people at the front of the room pushing me. And it's annoying for me to say that because I'm like just turned 25, like I should still be being pushed,
I'm so inspired by it, I'm 35 times your age, but I'm inspired by it. I love it. So it's energy preservation kind of at the top of your list. And then also just kind of considering more about who you are.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's good. Tracy, how were you impacted, shifted, changed?
Yeah. Well, a little bit of real talk is, I've lost, I think it's, as of last week, 23 people during the 18 months, most all of them artists. And, that's humbling. And I can't help but to think about, mortality and what our purpose here is. I think about that constantly. I think I have high blood pressure now too. I never have, but just the stress, and the sedentary nature of how we've been living our lives. But last May when my dad died, just 2 months before actually, I told him about this work trip that I was taking, that I was, speaking in Oxford. And for the first time in my life, he looked up at me and he said, "I'm real proud of you." Never has said that directly to me, ever. And he even blushed when he said it. He was embarrassed. And it made me think, for families of color, many of us who have, he grew up, it was rough. And so did all of his ancestors. We weren't afforded the privilege of joy, And so I think about that too in this time period, and how I've been changed is just recognizing that I live in a privileged moment. And I think about, what that sparkle in his eyes when he acknowledged that I was heading somewhere in honor of our ancestors, and to carry that joy forward.
Did you think more about your own mortality?
Think about
your own mortality
all the time.
Yeah, and did that push you to kind of go, I've got to do this, I got to make this thing?
That's so interesting you say that, because that was the other thing that popped in my mind when you asked the question is, I'm a quick decision maker now. I have more clarity, I make faster decisions, I trust my gut. And there is something to that. It's like, I don't know how much longer any of us are going to be here for. So I'm not wasting time as much.
Yeah. Energy preservation. It comes up again. Sharon, how have you been changed?
I think I'm still figuring that out.
Yeah.
I did a lot of, I'm just gonna be real, I did a lot of crying, a lot of sleeping, I went in and out of depression. Like, one day I'll be up, the next day I'll be down. I ask myself why a lot of the times. Why do I do this? Why do I do that? Is that important to me anymore? Why am I still doing it? And I'm just trying to figure it out. I'm trying to figure out, what do I want? I know what I've been doing, but like we was talking earlier in the locker room, in the green room. We was talking about what gives us joy, and so just trying to figure out what really and truly gives me joy, and how is that going to move me forward. And I'm really I'm trying some new things right now, and I'm doing some old things, and I'm just trying to figure out, what am I going to keep doing and why am I going to keep doing it? But the pandemic and the social unrest gave me the time to say stop and think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what it is.
So your practice, your artistic practice is shifting because
Definitely.
you're thinking about it differently.
Definitely.
Yeah. You all are so awesome. I could talk to you forever. But I think we're going to go to questions from our viewers. And if we don't have any questions from our viewers, I'm going to go on the street, okay?
Okay. I've got a question. This isn't from YouTube. This is just me personally. I know that art, there's a lot of external versus internal influence that happens, and I think a lot from the pandemic turned internal, our focusing on ourselves and our emotions. Did you feel like your art represented that change at all, or do you see any aspects of, that change?
The shift between internal and external influences, correct? In your art practice. Mm-hmm. I just want to make sure that I understand it too. The difference between creating something for an audience versus creating something for yourself, intrinsic value. Okay, all right, great. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I really miss being around women of color and recognizing the impact on my artistic internal voice that it has to be in community. And so I'm not sure about external or internal practice, but just even tonight realizing it's like, this feeds my soul, this feeds my spirit. I really needed this in this moment. And recognizing, moving forward, how to figure out how to cultivate that. I think, when we were talking earlier and I was sharing that, I just was like showing up and doing this and doing that and running here, running there, and not taking time to really appreciate what feeds my soul, or, what nurtures that spiritual self that, that artwork is born out of. It really is being in community with other women of color specifically.
Tracy, I know you as a curator as well. I don't know if you've had a chance to curate anything in the last 2 years, but I'm curious about how that might show up when you are curating again.
Yeah, I think about my experiences curating have been inside, and I think more about what would it be to collectively curate spaces outside and how we can move through the natural world in different ways. So I've been giving a lot of thought to that.
Nice, nice. Sharon or Amanda, you want to respond?
I think being able to say that I'm not ready to let the internal out. there was an opportunity for me to create a new piece for a rally around the social unrest. And I was like, I don't think I've ever turned down an opportunity to create a new piece for something. And I was like, I'm still in it. I'm not ready. And to know that I can hold on to what's inside of me for as long as I want to, and it will come out when the time is right, not necessarily because I'm getting $1 for it. And I think, so I might not write anything about the social unrest or COVID for years to come, and I'm okay with that because everybody doesn't have the right to know how I feel. I make the decision on when they get to know what I feel.
Well, all right then. I like that, though, just being sensitive to the rawness that still exists inside, because I think, and one of the things I know I experienced was a lot of talk among people is, we can't wait to get back to normal. And I kept going, really? That's what you want to do? You want to get back to normal? So it was still feeling like this experience I was having was not ready to express it publicly, so to speak, or just to be in public. Amanda, how about you?
I think I'm very eager to make things and create things. So like with every opportunity, I'm like, yes, I just want to do it because I have such limited opportunities in the workforce that or in the workplace that I'm in, even though I get paid well and I have like a nice job and everything's stable and like great. It's like, I want to have that experience, that growth and things like that. But to Tracy's point, I actually, for the first time, I worked with Nia Amina Minor. And it was the first time I ever worked with a woman of color and like choreographed with someone. And I was like, this changes everything. Like, this is amazing. And so I think with that, it's like not even thinking about like my audience, but it's like, who do you want to work with? You know, like not just like working with people to work with people or like who's going to pay you, but like who do you actually want to work with? Who do you think is going to make you grow and push you and who you're going to learn from? And like that, I don't know, that's just, it's enjoying the process itself rather than the outcome. Because when you're in a company that is like so focused on like, okay, we're doing these shows and we're gearing up to this, but then you're not enjoying the actual process. You're not thinking about like all those little moments, like the moments that can be spiritual and transformative and all of these things. I don't know, I'm trying to like find that more in everything I do. Because I mean, that takes up most of the time. That's like most of the time we spend is like the process, and then it's like one show or one thing, and it is gone in a flash. Right. So it's like if you're not enjoying the leading moments up to it, then it's like, I don't know, I feel like I was wasting my time.
But in many ways, it's like any job. If you hate the people you work with,
True that.
it makes the job hard. Or if you hate the work you do, right?
Yes,
it just makes it hard. There's no joy in that. So in that way, it's like every other thing. Any other questions?
We've got one more question. What can audience members do to make changes for artists in Seattle going forward?
Great question. What can audiences do going forward to make changes for artists? Going forward, going into the future. This is your opportunity to tell the opera audiences what they can do, or just, you know, in general.
Reparations and land back.
What does that look like?
There's so many different approaches.
Give us a couple of concrete examples,
All right.
Tracy.
Yes. First off, I want to acknowledge I made assumptions about our pronouns, so I just want to say that I love being in the company of artists of color, so I just want to acknowledge that. And then examples of land back, please start putting into your wills that whatever properties you have are going to your local tribes. Think about tithing, think about giving rather than consuming stuff. Give to your local food banks, give to your local tribal communities, you know, in ways that matter, not ways that you're not feeling the impact, give in a way that is true and authentic of your ability. And reparations, the same thing. There's so many different opportunities out there, and I see cities, especially in the East Coast, that are starting reparations programs. And think about your Black community centers, think about your HBCUs, your historically Black colleges and universities, and start giving directly to those institutions that can uplift communities and create educational opportunities for not only the next generation, but 7 generations forward.
Thank you, Tracy. And what you're talking about is building a community that's whole, that then uplifts the arts community.
100%.
I like that. I like it. What do you think, Amanda?
I mean, all of that.
Right?
You know, one thing I always think about is like, I always hear land acknowledgements happening, and then I'm like, well, okay, this is great, but I'm like, are these institutions even giving even a little money to these tribes, or, you know, like, I'm just, it kind of seems like there's such an importance in the land acknowledgement, but it's like, there needs to be more to it. And that's something I've thought about a lot. And going forward with my organization, I intend to pay to rent Duwamish and things like that, because it's so important. When it comes to audiences though, seeing work and stuff, demand what you want to see. Especially our younger generations, a lot of them don't want to see these old, 300-year-old productions, or change it up, spice it up, give us stories that reflect what's happening right now. Maybe it doesn't need to be about COVID, but things that are more current. And I think that's slowly happening in a lot of organizations, but I just think it needs to happen more. So yeah.
Didn't I read somewhere that Terrence Blanchard just scored a Black opera for the Met?
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
Opera's ahead of ballet. I'm gonna say right now, opera is ahead of ballet.
Yeah.
I'll say it.
Right on. All right, Sharon.
Yes, everything that they said, and in addition to what Tracy said as well, during the social unrest, Black organizations, no matter what they was doing, arts, social organizations, institutions, things of that nature, saw an uptick in donations because people was giving because they felt sorry and they felt bad. Don't stop that.
Okay. All
Keep
right.
that going.
Okay.
Continue that.
Keep the guilt
Keep the
contributions
guilt coming. Keep the guilt dollars coming, because it's important, and you affect the organization by putting them on a roller coaster ride of this is our budget this year, and we're way up here, and then because the social unrest is done, then you're putting us in jeopardy of having to close because you don't give the next year. So don't stop.
Yeah.
Don't stop that. And then if you're going to be an ally or what have you, if you're going to support art, then support it from a stance of you're learning, and not a stance of you feel sorry for somebody. Don't come up to us and hug us and tell us how sorry you feel for us just because we just put our heart out on the stage and we're like, we feel so, it was, don't do that. So, and then hold the organizations accountable. They say they was gonna do something. If they got an equity statement on their website, on that front page, and you don't see any equity, call them out on it. Don't wait for the Black girl in the organization or the Black boy or the Black person in the organization to have to call it out.
Yeah.
Call them out.
All right.
And tell them, yo, get your stuff together. Almost, ooh.
I love you, Sharon Williams. I love you, Tracy Rector. I am getting to love you, Amanda Morgan. You're new in my life, but you can't get out now. And I have to give what I would like to see audiences do. Maybe it's not audiences, it's organizations. The first time I came into this space, my thought was, wouldn't it be fabulous if a Black organization was co-located here? So I would love to see more thought go into how can we co-locate and share some of the spatial relationships that we might have in the community. I want to say thank you to Seattle Opera, everybody here involved. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for inviting these incredibly brilliant women here tonight. And we'll see you all back. I think we all come back to see La Bohème. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.